Okay, so thank you, Thomas, and thanks everybody. It is always nice to be here in Tübingen. And in this talk, I will speak about Prawitz's proof-theoretic semantics based on the notion of valid argument. Can I? Okay. So about Prawitz's proof-theoretic semantics based on the notion of valid argument, and I will add nothing new from a, so to say, extensional point of view, namely no new results or definitions or the like. I just want to suggest that when I look at that from a certain perspective or given a certain interpretation, these semantics undergo a seemingly interesting symmetry between two levels, which are standardly required, at least since task in a formal semantics for a formal language. And these are the levels of what I will call local validity and global validity. At the first level, one interprets the non-logical expressions occurring in semantically relevant objects onto certain interpretation structures, while at the global level, since one wants to speak of logical validity, one quantifies overall such structures to obtain a notion which is independent from non-logical meanings. In modal theory, the local level corresponds to the interpretation of a formula over a set theoretic structure, while the global level corresponds to the formula being true on all structures. In Prawitz's semantics, what we interpret are not formulas, but arguments, and the local level corresponds to the validity of the argument over an atomic base, which is taken as fixing non-logical meaning, while the global level amounts to the validity of the argument over all bases. The symmetry stems roughly, and with the spoiler alert, from the fact that while in modal theory we only need to interpret the non-logical terminology of our background language, in Prawitz's semantics we must add to this the interpretation of non-introductory inferences which may occur in arguments. So Prawitz's semantics can be understood as a generalization of some normalization theorems that Prawitz himself proved for various Keynesian systems of natural deduction. As known, these theorems showed that derivations in the systems can be reduced to forms without the tools, namely occurrences of formulas which are maximal in the sense of being both conclusions of introductions and major premises of eliminations. It turns out that forms without the tools, also called normal, have a sharp and semantically relevant structure because their parts can be ordered following a criterion of complexity of formulas, as well as formulas being derived one from another based on inference principles which directly stem from the meaning of the formulas. In natural deduction, this order is, as known, E part, namely a part where only eliminations are used and where we move from the more to the less complex, a minimal part where only rules for the absurd are used, and finally an I part where only introductions are used and where we move from the less to the more complex. An interesting aspect of normalization is that the systems for which it holds can be referred to different atomic proof systems. Namely, to logical rules, we add atomic rules for proving facts about the atoms of our language. Normalization still holds within the expanded system, except that the minimal part of normal derivations will now also contain atomic rules. So I have spoken of eliminations and introductions, but we may generalize this, saying that in a normal derivation, we have first some normal inferences, followed by primitive or privileged inferences. The reduction to normal form is carried out by applying some reduction procedures which show precisely that the non-privileged inferences are, in a sense, conservative or harmonic with respect to the privileged ones. In other words, when suitable conditions are met, all that is derivable with the non-privileged rules would have been already derivable by using privileged rules only. As a consequence of this, one may expect that under the same conditions, any derivation should end by applying a privileged rule. And this corollary of normalization, which is qualified as fundamental by Schildheiser, does indeed hold, since in systems like intuitionistic logic, we can prove that if something is proved categorically, then the proof can be reduced to unending with an introduction. Now, why is this corollary qualified as fundamental? It is fundamental for what? The answer is for appreciating the semantic weight of Prawitz's normalization theory. Some months ago, in another talk I gave in this weekly seminar, I argued that Prawitz's semantics could be understood as a good distance of Kreisel's informal rigor, and I'm still convinced of this. Normalization, which is essentially a formal result, as it refers to formal systems, contains or encapsulates the seed of semantics based on non-strictly formalistic principles. This semantic reading permits us to establish a symmetry between what happens in formal systems, which enjoy sufficiently suitable structural properties, and what happens semantically, namely what kind of semantic viewpoint seems to be both inspired and confirmed by the behavior of these systems. This symmetry is, in a way, in the background of the symmetries that I want to discuss here, so let me say something more about it. The idea is simply the following. A number of notions which are at play when proving normalization for formal systems can be generalized to notions on which a proof-theoretic semantics may be based, and vice versa. These principles may be understood as instantiated by the former notions. The idea that the derivation can reduce to a sharp form without the tools becomes the idea that we can extract the kernel which the deductive power of the derivation stems from. Similarly, the idea that normalization is invariant when you add an atomic system to your logic may be understood as a sign of the fact that the structural properties of derivations that normalization singles out are independent of the meaning of the non-logical constants. The meaning of the logical constants is instead relevant in the light of the fundamental corollary, so that the privileged rules can be semantically understood as meaning constitutive, and based on this, one can take reductions to show not only a kind of conservativity of derivability, but a kind of harmony between privileged and non-privileged rules, in the sense that non-introductory inferences allow us to prove only what is provable compatibly with the meaning as fixed by the privileged inferences. Thus, normal derivations have a form which shows that non-normal derivations owe their deductive force to the balance between rules and meaning. And finally, the fundamental corollary shows that this force in the end depends on the meaning constitutive inferences. Now, this generalization of normalization is in the end based on some semantic insights, which are, so to say, twofold. On the one side, they look at deduction, while on the other, they look at meaning. We may say that the semantic reading is inspired, guided by these principles, but we may say as well that these principles are suggested by normalization. There is no prior direction, and this is why Prawitz's semantics is, in my mind, an example of informal rigor. Now, these principles are, first, Gensen's idea that introductions fix the meaning of the logical constants, whereas eliminations can be shown to be unique functions of the corresponding introductions. Second, the Prawitz's inversion principle, first formulated in a slightly different form by Lorenzen, according to which non-privileged rules, if acceptable, should be such that if you have proved their major premise through a privileged rule, then the latter proof, when suitably combined with proofs of the minor premises, already contain a proof of the conclusion of the non-primitive inference. And finally, Dammett's fundamental assumption, which kind of transforms the fundamental corollary of normalization theory into a semantic axiom, requiring that if something is provable, then there must be a proof of it ending with a primitive inference, a so-called canonical proof. In Prawitz's proof-theoretic semantics, there are two main ingredients at play, which, like in the case of the general semantic framework, are also drawn from normalization theory. The first is the idea that the logical level should act upon an underlying atomic level. So you will have two kinds of rules, basically atomic, which is the first example here, and the logical. And second, we have the idea that the non-primitive inference steps must be justified by reductions for eliminating major premises obtained by introduction. And in the slide, you see a standard example for eliminating maximal occurrences of implication. Now, how to achieve the required generality of a semantics? Since we want our core notion to be that of valid argument, we cannot require arguments to be limited to fixed stocks of rules. This is in principle wrong, for when one speaks of proving something, one usually refers to proofs understood in a broad sense, i.e. proving something in some framework, not a previously chosen one. Anyway, limiting ourselves to a chosen system would also be wrong because of Gödel's incompleteness results. We surely want to account for valid arguments in first-order arithmetic, and we know that no recursive system can contain all such arguments. Thus, we need a general notion of argument structure where arbitrary inferences are applied. An argument structure is still conceived of as a tree in a Gensen format, with indications of possible bindings of assumptions. But since we distinguish privileged and non-privileged inferences, we should also distinguish canonical and non-canonical argument structures, the former being those which end by applying a privileged inference, whilst the second end by applying a non-primitive inference. We also introduce a Freudian distinction between open and closed argument structures. The latter are the structures, all the assumptions of which have been bound by before the root of the tree, otherwise the structure is open. We now have to generalize accordingly the notion of reduction for eliminating the tools. These reduction functions will be now looked at as justification procedures, since they do not simply eliminate the tools, but show how non-introductory inferences are conservative or harmonic or stable. We have some notions with respect to how meaning has been fixed by the primitive inferences. The definition is as follows. Given a rule R, let us indicate with UR the class of the structures ending with applications of R. A justification procedure phi for R is a constructive function defined on some subset B of UR, such that for every D in B, phi D has the same conclusion as and no more unbound assumptions than D. We may add to this also a linearity condition for dealing with substitutions of assumptions with arguments for these assumptions. And we require the justification to be linear with respect to this substitution. Anyway, for reasons that will become clear later, I also introduce a notion of expansion of a set of justification procedures J. J plus is to be a set of justification procedures which includes J, and such that the complement of J plus with respect to J justify rules which are always disjoint from any rule justified by some element of J. We can drop out the disjointness requirement and we obtain what Schedeheiser called alternative justifications. Now, atomic bases, which we already had when proving normalization for logical systems, receive now a semantic reading by saying that they fix, determine, or indicate the meaning of the non-logical terminology of our background language. The idea is that the meaning of each non-logical component of the alphabet is fixed by how this component behaves in deduction, and in particular, in atomic derivation from atomic systems. Although this idea about the determination of non-logical meaning is sufficiently clear from an intuitive point of view, it is difficult to make it more precise. Observe that here we have no functions from the alphabet on two set theoretic structures like in model theory. Each component may occur in more than one rule, and in each rule it may occur together with other components. So meaning is, so to say, split and shared. One may require that these rules are somehow ordered. So some concern the component more immediately than others, like in Kotzos' atomistic theory of meaning. However, I shall not go through these details here. I will also abstract from whether our atomic rules may or not bind assumptions and variables. I will just define atomic bases as sequences of three elements, C, R, and sigma, where C and R are respectively the individual variable and relational constants of our background language L, while sigma is an atomic system of rules over C and R of the kind that you see in the middle of the slide. So these are rules where premises and conclusion are atomic formulas, and we may have some constraints on the form of these formulas. Now, one of the basic ideas of Prawitz semantics, one which derives from Gensen's treatment of deduction as derivation from possibly unbound assumptions, is that valid arguments may be open, namely a conclusion may be validly inferred from a non-null number of pending hypotheses. Now, here there are a number of philosophical issues, but I will skip them. So we need the notion of open valid argument, which is in a way more important than the notion of closed valid argument, because the notion of open valid argument is used for defining logical consequence. But on the other hand, the notion of valid argument, when it is open, it is defined in terms of the notion of closed valid argument. So we have this kind of tension here in Prawitz semantics, but this is not something we shall be concerned with here. We are now in the position to give a first definition, which is the definition of the notion of validity of an argument over an atomic base. An argument is a pair dj, where D is an argument structure, and J is a set of reduction procedures. This is valid over an atomic base B if and only if. If D is closed, it reduces by applying in some order the elements of J to a canonical form whose immediate substructures, when paired with J, are valid over B. When D is open, each closed distance of B must be valid. Now, this latter claim may be understood in two different ways, and this is the first important point in this talk, although a very well-known one. The closure of D may be as follows. We replace the unbound assumptions of D with closed valid arguments which are valid over the very same base we are already working in, namely B. I will call NE this first no expansion approach, indicated in red color in the block. Otherwise, the closure of D may be obtained by replacing the assumptions of D with closed valid arguments for these assumptions, which are valid with respect not only to B, but also to an expansion of B, say B plus. I will call WE this second with expansion approach, and it is indicated in blue color in the block. Now, of course, assumptions are replaced not by arguments, but by closed argument structures. However, these structures come with expansions of J, since we may need to justify rules which are in the new structures and which were not in D. So the resulting instance of D must be valid on B in an E and on B plus in WE, when paired with the corresponding expansion of J. Observe that in this way, we are in fact universally quantifying over structures ending with these assumptions and over expansions of J. Now, the alternative that we have just described concerns what in the beginning of this talk I called local validity, namely a definition of validity relatively to structures where no logical terminology is interpreted, namely atomic bases. Now, we also have at the global level, where one universally quantifies over these structures, the atomic bases, with the aim of defining logical validity. I want to argue that some symmetries can be found between these two alternatives, as well as between the respective oppositions underlying them. Before going to this, let us first of all see what these alternatives at the global level are. Logical validity can be defined in two ways. First, what I will call system-rooted validity. A can be said to be a logical consequence of gamma if and only if there is an argument structure D such that for every base B, there is a set of justifying procedures J such that Dj is valid over B. Thus, in this reading, for A to be a logical consequence of gamma, we require the existence of an argument structure which can be justified by a suitable and base-depending set of justifying procedures. In the second reading, we invert the order of quantifiers, namely A is a logical consequence of gamma, if and only if there is an argument structure D such that for some set of justifying procedures J, for every base B, Dj is valid over B. The set of justifying procedures which we require to exist for justifying the non-primitive inferences of D must now be one and the same, working on all bases. For this reason, I will speak in this case of schematic validity. Now, there is a clear way in which one can move from system-rooted validity to schematic validity, namely through the axiom of choice, which can be constructively justified and in some systems, like Martin Löw's type theory, even proved by endorsing a corresponding constructive reading of the existential quantifier. In this case, the choice function which picks the right set of justification procedures on every base should play the role of a schematic justifying procedure for the argument structure at issue. Although this is true, I will abstract from this issue in what follows and consider system-rooted and schematic validity as distinct ways of accounting for logical validity. Now, to address the symmetry between the so far mentioned alternatives, we must now look at what the distinction about whether to bring in expansions or not at the local level amounts to. And this is monotonicity. The NE reading is non-monotonic, namely there is an argument Dj which is NE valid over some B, but which ceases to be so over some expansion of B. Say, let D be the argument from atom P to atom Q justified by the empty set. This is valid over the empty base simply because there is no closed valid argument for P over this base. But if we expand the base by adding P as an axiom, not only our empty justification ceases to work, but we cannot even find a justification which renders valid the argument from atom P to atom Q because we have no proof of Q in the base. WE is instead monotonic. So for every expansion B plus of B, if Dj is WE valid on B, then Dj is WE valid on B plus. But WE has also another interesting property, namely it allows us to prove that logical validity is in fact tantamount to validity over the empty system, i.e. Dj is valid over every B if and only if it is valid over the empty system, So A is a logical consequence of gamma if and only if a dj for A from gamma exists, which is valid over the anti-system. In a sense, this is a possible way of conceiving of logical validity of an argument. Since this argument must be valid only by virtue of the logical form of the formulas it involves, we may take this to mean that the non-logical components play no role in it. So we can leave undetermined whether the meaning of these components, what the meaning of these components is. Now, the first point that I want to highlight is that both NE and WE have pros and cons at the local level, and that these pros and cons are conceptually similar to those pertaining to the choice between system-rooted and schematic validity at the local level, at the global level. NE captures a very intuitive idea of validity of an argument over a base. What does it mean that an argument is valid over a base? Well, it means one may say that this argument owes its validity to both its logical and its non-logical terminology. While the meaning of the logical terminology is fixed once and for all by general semantic principles, the meaning of the non-logical terminology is given by atomic bases. So to have validity at the local level, we must look at the balance between non-logical meanings and how non-introductory inferences are justified. I will take here the attribution of a reduction to a non-primitive inference as a kind of interpretation of an inference. So we may say, in the end, that NE captures the idea that the validity of an argument at the local level depends on the interaction between non-logical terminology and meaning of rules. This is very much in line with the model theoretic idea of truth of a formula in a structure. But while in model theory one only evaluates the non-logical terminology, the fact that in Prawitz what is evaluated are arguments implies that in this proof-theoretic semantics at the local level, we must consider both non-logical meanings and meaning of rules. Now, all this concerns meaning, but Prawitz's semantics is a semantics whose core is deduction. Although deduction owes its force to meaning, it is a satisfactory notion of deduction which is of primary interest for us. Now, if this is the point, we should have monotonicity. Intuitively, if something is deductively proved, then it remains proved even when we expand the knowledge base. This is a basic intuition captured instead by WE. So WE has some pros too. Along very much the same lines, we can single out some cons of both NE and WE. NE is non-monotonic, so we lose the idea that our primary focus is on deduction. We put, so to say, too much a burden on the semantic side of our semantics. We read the proof-theoretic semantics with the accent on semantics rather than on proof-theoretic. With WE, we have a specular problem. The accent is now on proof-theoretic rather than on semantics. But the problem is now the following. As said, atomic bases fix the meaning of the non-logical constants. So when we define validity in the open case by bringing in expansions of the base, we are actually evaluating the validity of an open argument, and at the same time, we are changing the meaning of the terminology on which this validity depends. The situation is now very different from the model theoretic one. When one interprets a formula in a structure, and then one considers freely generated expansions of this structure, one assumes that the original interpretation remains stable throughout these expansions. The interpretation function is expanded, but not modified on the unexpanded set. When we change the base instead, we may do this by adding rules for symbols for which some rules already exist in the unexpanded base, so we are introducing new meanings. Thus, with the WE, the focus is much more on the deductive side. We are not checking that non-primitive rules are semantically compatible with a certain meaning for the non-logical terminology. We are instead checking that they remain deductively convincing with respect to the whole semantic range which, starting from an intended meaning, this terminology may come to have. This is very much seen when logical validity is equated with validity over the anti-system. One may understand logical validity as validity where no logical meaning plays no role. All that matters is that the logical form, all that matters is the logical form, in the sense that we need not know what non-logical meanings are. But one may also say, well, no, logical validity should mean that our rules remain valid, whatever the interpretation of our non-logical terminology is, whatever the role it plays in the validity of the argument may be. The latter idea, so that the validity remains the same whatever the interpretation of the non-logical terminology is, corresponds to the first semantic relation, which I will call models one. Models one tells exactly this. A is a logical consequence of gamma when there is an argument for A from gamma, which can be justified on every base. This justification may vary and essentially depend on the non-logical meanings as fixed by the base. What matters is that the argument structures always prove, the argument structure always proves A starting from gamma. The idea that instead the logical validity of an argument should completely abstract from non-logical meanings is at play in the second semantic relation, which I will call models two. Here, one and the same argument, and above all, one and the same justification must work on all bases. If they cannot be interpreted in accordance with the base, they already come with an interpretation. Both these ideas are reasonable, but both present some shortcomings as well. By inverting our viewpoint, the process of models one becomes the concept of models two, and vice versa. Models one risks being too model theoretic as pertains meaning of rules. A rule is deductively valid when it remains so independently of non-logical meanings, which means that this property must hold not of the formulas involved by the rule, but of the reductions associated to the formula, which is really what the rule amounts to in proof-theoretic semantics. Similarly, models two risks being too syntactic because deductive validity may in the end be strictly tied to certain non-logical meanings. Perhaps the point may be seen by considering what an analogous situation would be in model theoretic semantics. Here, we have that the logical constants are interpreted in one and the same way over all structures, say as true functions with a fixed behavior. Our logical constants are now the non-primitive rules, so this, the model theoretic reading, would amount to models two, so to the exists for all reading. Models one instead will be the idea that the connectives are interpreted in possibly different ways over the different structures, just like the non-logical terminology. And for each structure, we can find a suitable interpretation in terms of a truth function of these connectives. Some literature refers to a categoricity problem for the interpretation of the logical constants. For example, Carnap deals extensively with this problem. I'm not sure whether my line of thought is correct, but if it is, this may be a nice research line. So the connection between this categoricity problem and this idea of changing the interpretation of non-primitive inferences. So overall, we have 2 points here. First, NE and WE are in a way opposed ways to understand local validity. NE focuses on the interaction between non-logical meanings and meaning of rules, while WE focuses on the soundness of a certain interpretation. The opposition between models one and models two is mutatis mutandis. Range of the non-logical terminology to the justifiability over the non-primitive rule of the non-primitive rules over this range. Models two understands rules as coming with a fixed interpretation and then check whether this interpretation works on all bases. Now, the internal opposition is thus symmetric on both levels. But another way of looking at the problem is by saying that the reasons for choosing NE rather than WE are very much the same only at the local level as those for choosing models one at the global level and vice versa. In other words, models one just takes NE and its idea that meaning of rules must be in a good balance with non-logical meanings and generalizes this to all atomic bases. Models two does the same with WE, for it generalizes the idea that meaning of rules must be deductively sound over whole semantic range, except that at variance with the local level, this range is now not determined by a prior determination by some specific rules. Now, if one accepts this reconstruction, one may be led to think that the only coherent ways of developing Prawitz semantics are those which respect these opposition alternative symmetries, these symmetries. Namely, one should require that one chooses NE at the local level if and only if one chooses models one at the global level. Likewise, one chooses WE at the local level if and only if one chooses models two at the global level. Now, these two Prawitzian semantics, NE plus models 1 and WE plus models 2, are perfectly coherent from a conceptual point of view and also in line with Prawitz's intentions. But these excludes mixed readings like NE plus models 2 and WE plus models 1, which are often found in the literature. Indeed, Prawitz himself endorses NE plus models 2, usually. Is there a reason why these readings, although violating the above-told symmetries, can nonetheless be reasonably formulated and even used? So the answer is yes. And the reasons is that the symmetries we have highlighted so far seemingly stem from a deeper interaction in Prawitz's semantics, which we have already hinted at many times so far. The interaction between non-logical meanings and meaning of rules. So far, we have not really dealt with this opposition, but rather with the opposition between logical and non-logical terminology on one hand, and the relation which meaning of rules has with this opposition on the other. We have basically said that this can happen either by letting rules interact with the non-logical meanings, while logical meaning is fixed, or that non-primitive rules are also fixed and are tested over a variably wide semantic range for the non-logical terminology. But let us look at the issue from another perspective. What we do at the local level is focusing on the validity of an argument with respect to an atomic base, while in a way, we also abstract from or take for granted that we have some set of justifying procedures for the argument structure at issue. This focus on the atomic base may be such that either atomic bases are considered one at a time, namely without expansions, or as belonging to some generated set of bases, namely with expansions. At the global level, the situation is in all ways similar, except that the focus has changed from bases to justifying procedures. And abstraction from now means that we are abstracting from bases in the sense that we are universally quantifying overall bases. Again, either we take one set of justifying procedure at a time, like in models 1, or consider this focused element as referred to a set of bases, which in this case is the set of all bases. So we have actually four overall ingredients at play: a degree, which may be local or global, a focus, which may be on basis or on reductions, and conversely, the abstraction, and a range, which may be one at a time, but I prefer the expression one and the same, shortly O and S, or refer to a class, in which case I will speak of a semantic range. So at the local level, we have focus on basis, abstraction from justifying procedures, and the alternative whether the focused component is O and S or semantic. At the global level, we have focus on justifying procedures, abstraction from basis, and the alternative whether the focused component is O and S exists for all, or semantic for all exists. So as you can see, there is a symmetry here because everything is fixed except that at the local level we focus on basis, and at the global level we focus on reductions. And so this can be seen from these tables. The first table shows the ingredients in bold character and the component which these ingredients apply in green. When the degree is local, the focus is on basis, and the abstraction is on justifying procedures. When the degree is global, the focus is on justifying functions, on reductions, and the abstraction is on basis. In the second table, the resulting semantics are ordered according to the previous coherence order. NE plus models 1, red, and WE plus models 2 in blue. So this is the first symmetry we have seen. In the third table, the order depends on whether at each level we consider the focused element as O and S or as semantic. In the first case, we have the mixed reading NE plus models 2 in red, while in the second we have the mixed reading WE plus models 1 in blue. And now so if we kind of mix these two tables with indications of symmetries, we obtain this diagram, the proof-theoretic square. So the red arrows connect NE with the global level, while the blue arrows do the same with WE. The arrows labeled by S constitute the ingredients order, so the one where we just changed the focused element of the second table in the previous slide, so the last table here. Whereas C indicates the coherence order. So whether we choose to deal with the semantic or more deductive approach to the semantics. The brown arrows indicate simple implications. So if an argument is W valid, then it is NE valid, and if A is a models 2 consequence of gamma, then it is models 1 consequence of gamma. Now, it is perhaps interesting to observe that the implication arrows respect the direction local-global when we choose the coherence explanation. If NE is paired with models 1 and W with models 2, then W implies NE in the same way as models 2 implies models 1. This is coherence, indeed. This is why the approach can be said to be coherent. The order is inverted with the order with the other pairing. We move from something weaker but broader at the local level to something stronger but stricter at the global level if we choose NE plus models 2, or the other way around if we choose WE plus models 1. And this is the idea that, so the first reading may be the idea that logical validity is in a way stronger or more relevant to logic than local validity, than validity onto a base. The other is instead the almost inverse idea that logical validity should generalize local validity. So in a way, this is also something which Cemendi says about model theoretic semantics, namely that the selling point of model theoretic semantics is that logical validity is explained as a simple generalization of truth on a structure. And so this would correspond to WE plus models 1. Now, should we, so this is the explanation of the diagram. Should we now stop here? Are there further possible combinations of our ingredients, or is the proof-theoretic square complete? We may just adopt a combinatorial approach. We have actually four ingredients. Focus and abstractions are applied to two components, namely basis and/or reductions, while range determines the way we should treat the focused component or components. With this in mind, we may consider the space of possible both local and global formulation as given by one of the 16 pairs which we obtain with the Cartesian product that you see in this slide, in the middle of this slide. But since each local level must be combined with the global level, and there are 8 local and 8 global levels, readings, we have a total of 64 possible semantics out of our 4 ingredients. Now, of course, this combinatorial approach is not likely to always give us formulations which make sense, but some of these formulations may make sense. I will now consider some of them, but before doing this, I want to say something about how the formulations themselves should be understood. So at the local level, focus indicates the scope of O and S and semantic, while abstract means that we are indeed abstracting from the component. Since we are at the local level, this should not be understood in the sense that we are reasoning over an arbitrary abstracted component, since this will mean that we are universally quantifying over this component. But that in a way, we are keeping it fixed, and we are considering a specific yet not specified component of that type. O and S means that we do not take expansions of the focused component into account, vice versa with semantic. Of course, both components may be focused and both may be abstracted. In the latter cases, we may conceive of having one focused abstracted component with O and S and the other with semantic. This will yield more combinations, but in the end, this does not change anything. So I will always suppose that in a way, they are either both O and S or either both semantic. At the global level, focus once again indicates the scope of O and S and semantic, and in particular, we have now the following restriction. The focused element, if any, must be existentially quantified over, while the abstracted from component, if any, must be universally quantified over. When we have one focused and one abstracted from abstracted component, O and S means that the quantifier order exists for all, while semantic indicates that the quantifier order is for all exists. Also in this case, we may have that both components are focused or both are abstracted, and in this case, the distinction between O and S and semantic is pointless because the order of quantifiers becomes irrelevant. They are both universally quantified or existentially quantified, so we can change the order of quantifiers as we want. Now, let us see some examples. Suppose that we are at the local level. We are focusing on both reductions and bases. And for both of them, we bring expansions in. Now, this would correspond to the following definition. dj is valid over b if and only if, for every j plus, if d is closed, then d reduces through the elements of j plus to a canonical form, which, when paired with j plus, is valid over b. While, if d is open, for every closed d star j plus plus, for assumptions of b which be valid with respect to some expansion of b, so b plus, the result of appending d to d star and paired with j plus plus is valid over b plus. So basically, this is the same definition as before, except that in the beginning of the definition, we quantify over expansions of the reduction functions. Now, observe that, so basically the expansions of the reduction functions must be put at the beginning of the definition, because in a way they are already presupposed in the original definition. So when we replace the argument structures, the assumptions with the closed arguments for these assumptions, we are already quantifying over expansions of the reduction functions. So a real modification of this should be that we quantify on the reduction function before making the substitution of the assumptions. Now, this definition is easily seen to be equivalent to WE. While, well, because both if we consider consistent expansions and alternative justifications, if D is reducible through J to some required form, then D is reducible to this form for every expansion of J. For strong validity, things may change, of course, but I will not dwell upon this here. Suppose we are at the local level, and we abstract from both J and B, and we require a semantic aptitude on the focus set components. But there are no focus set components, so this is equivalent to an E with respect to the specific but not specified the J and B we are considering. Suppose we are now at the global level. We abstract from J and focus on B, and we have O and S. The definition is A is a logical consequence of gamma if and only if there is D such that for some B for every J, dj is valid with respect to B. Now, it is easy to prove that such a B surely exists when some assumption of D is not provable on B. So this definition validates all inferences from inconsistent premises, which is fine, at least if you are at least intuitionist, but also inferences whose premises are provable on some, but not all bases. Also, an inference from a tautology to a tautology will not be valid under this reading because one of the reduction function is simply identity. And so in the case of identity, you have no reduction and the argument does not reduce to a canonical form. This definition of logical validity is conceptually bad. So you can prove exactly the same things for the other possible combinations. And in the end, it turns out that each of the 16 either local or global readings obtained by combining elements of the Cartesian product above are either void or conceptually bad or equivalent to one of the four which compose the proof-theoretic square. So the claim is that the square is complete in the sense that if we accept to look at Prawitz's semantics as made up of the two components, basis and reductions, and the four ingredients, degree, focusing, abstraction, and range, we have four and only four acceptable Prawitzian readings. I now want to conclude with some side issues. So how much time do I have? Can I? Okay. So I want now to conclude with some side issues. First, so far we have dealt with the distinction pertaining whether the terminology of proofs is logical or non-logical, which is why we focused on atomic basis and universal quantification over these bases. This led us to singling out the symmetries and ingredients that I have discussed. But another way of looking at balances within Prawitz's semantics consists in asking what valid arguments are used for. Are they used to prove facts about abstract or conceptual domains? Or do they deal with arguments concerning an empirical domain, or both? If we take this road, then our classification of Prawitzian semantics seems both to undergo some further constraints and to partly follow a different rationale. When we consider the pure logical validity of an argument, then we have the distinction between ND and WE at the local level and the one between models 1 and models 2 at the global level. But when we come to consider the content of the formulas of our argument, and we distinguish whether this content is empirical or not, we may not expect the logical rules to be totally independent from this content. So the proper reading, both at the local and at the global level, should be one where meaning of rules is quite strictly intertwined with meaning of rules, with the non-logical meanings. On the other hand, however, when the content is non-empirical, the fact that it be, say, abstract or conceptual or whatever along these lines may imply that we should, after all, have monotonicity at the local level, since, to put it with Gödel, we never have complete concepts, and thus we need to consider expansions of bases rather than one base at a time. Thus, we have WE plus model swan. When the content of the sentences is instead empirical, we cannot have monotonicity because it is clear that our empirical reasoning is not so. So in this case, the reading is NE plus model swan. Now, these remarks were raised by Cozzo when I discussed with him briefly these topics. And so this led us to the following slide, because this perspective requires us to look inside the content of the formulas which build arguments up. Some conceptual constraints are put on our semantic choices by a prior determination of, say, the scope of our semantic analysis, whether it concerns arguments for abstract or else for empirical content. But this means that a certain level of analysis and insight must be put already in the inferences of the argument. It is for this reason that we may, in this case, use Cozzo's notion of argumentation step. A Cozzo's argumentation step is a quite rich entity, as it includes 7 factors, of which only the first and the last must be non-empty. A conclusion, a certain non-linguistic evidence based on which the conclusion is asserted, a number of premises which support the conclusion, possibly arguments for these premises, and these 2 things constitute what Cozzo calls the linguistic evidence for the conclusion. Then there may be indication of bindings of variables and assumptions, and finally, a degree indicating whether the step is to be conclusive or not. Observe that in this way we can distinguish between linguistic and non-linguistic evidence and conclusiveness. Already within arguments, we may thus develop a different notions of validity for different types of arguments, depending on the type of steps they include. And this perspective may be worth of being explored. I just want to specify that so far I have not spoken about many notions which are usually associated with 2 atomic bases. For example, whether atomic rules bind or not assumptions of variables. Taking these properties into account may be relevant for at least 2 points. First, whether the reasons for choosing among these properties are similar to those for choosing between monotonicity and non-monotonicity, or between schematic or system-rooted validity. And second, whether the above told classification changes. I cannot dwell upon this now. And there are finally some questions concerning the relation between Prawitz's proof-theoretic and standard model theoretic semantics. For example, we already observed that while atomic bases play in Prawitz's semantics the same role as structures in model theory, extensions of structures in model theory does not give rise usually to problems of monotonicity, because the expansions are freely generated in the sense that the interpretation given for the unexpanded structure remains stable throughout the expansion. This is a double-edged blade, since it also shows that Prawitz's semantics may deal in a quite easy way with validity over changement of meaning. And so this is all. Thank you.